Imagine stepping into a time machine and emerging in the year 1750. The first thing that would assault your senses wouldn't be the sight of horse-drawn carriages or the sound of church bells echoing through cobblestone streets. It would be the smell, a pungent, overwhelming cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting food, animal waste and smoke that would make your modern sensibilities reel in horror. Welcome to the 18th century, where the concept of daily hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist, and where a person's relationship with cleanliness was governed by beliefs, superstitions, and practices that would seem utterly foreign to us today. The year is 1723, and in a modest wooden house in colonial Philadelphia, Mary Henderson begins her weekly ritual. It's Monday morning, and the dreaded task of laundry looms before her like a mountain to be climbed. But this isn't the simple matter of tossing clothes into a machine and pressing a button. This is an exhausting, back-breaking ordeal that will consume the better part of 3 days and involve every member of her household. Mary rises before dawn, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The fire in the hearth has died to glowing embers, and she must first coax it back to life. Wood is precious, and every stick must be carefully rationed. As the flames grow stronger, she begins the laborious process of heating water in large iron kettles. These kettles, blackened with soot and heavy as stones, must be filled bucket by bucket from the well in her backyard. While the water heats, Mary sorts through the family's clothing, separating the whites from the colored garments. But these aren't the bright, varied colors we might expect. Most clothing is dyed in muted browns, grays, and deep blues, colors that hide dirt well and fade slowly. The wealthy might own garments in brighter hues, but for ordinary families like the Hendersons, practicality reigns supreme. The soap Mary uses isn't the convenient bar of ivory or bottle of liquid detergent we take for granted. It's a harsh, caustic substance made from animal fat and wood ash, boiled together in a process that fills the house with acrid smoke and nauseating odors. This soap, when it works, can strip dirt from fabric, but it's equally capable of stripping skin from hands and color from cloth. Many women's hands bear the permanent scars and chemical burns from years of handling this primitive cleaning agent. As the water reaches a rolling boil, Mary begins the actual washing process. Each garment must be individually scrubbed on a washboard, a ridged wooden surface that serves as both cleaning tool and instrument of torture for delicate fabrics. The hot, soapy water scalds her hands as she works, but there's no alternative. Rubber gloves won't be invented for another century. The physical demands of laundry in the 1700s were staggering. A single load of washing could weigh over 100 pounds when wet, and everything had to be lifted, wrung, and maneuvered by hand. Women frequently suffered from chronic back problems, arthritis, and what we would now recognize as repetitive stress injuries from the constant scrubbing, wringing, and lifting. But the challenges didn't end with the washing. Once cleaned, our clothes had to be rinsed multiple times in fresh water, water that had to be heated and carried just like the wash water. Then came the wringing, a process that required 2 people working in tandem to twist the fabric until most of the water was expelled. This was dangerous work. More than one person lost fingers caught in the twisted fabric. Weather played a crucial role in the laundry process. Clothes had to be dried outdoors, weather permitting, and this meant that laundry could only be done on days when rain wasn't expected. In winter, wet clothes would freeze solid on the line, requiring them to be brought indoors to thaw before they could properly dry. This filled the house with moisture and the musty smell of damp fabric. The ironing process was equally challenging. Irons were solid pieces of metal that had to be heated over the fire. Without any temperature control, it was all too easy to scorch delicate fabrics or, conversely, to use an iron that wasn't hot enough to smooth the wrinkles. Women learned to test the heat by spitting on the iron and listening to the sizzle, or by holding the iron close to their cheek to feel the radiant heat. For the wealthy, laundry was somewhat less burdensome, not because the process was any easier, but because they could afford to own more clothing and therefore wash less frequently. A wealthy merchant might own a dozen shirts, allowing him to wear a clean one, while the others were being washed, dried, and ironed. But even the wealthiest families still dealt with the same fundamental challenges of heating water, making soap, and the physical demands of the washing process. The frequency of laundry varied greatly by social class and geography. Urban families with limited space and resources might wash clothes only monthly or even less frequently. Rural families with more access to water and space for drying might manage weekly washing. But for everyone, the process was so labor-intensive that it dominated the household schedule. Monday was universally known as washing day, Tuesday was for ironing, and the entire rhythm of domestic life revolved around this weekly cycle. The types of fabrics available also affected the laundry process. Cotton, which we consider a basic everyday fabric, was actually quite expensive in the 1700s. Most ordinary people wore clothes made from wool or linen. Wool was warm but difficult to clean. It could shrink, felt, or be damaged by the harsh soaps. Linen was easier to wash, but expensive to produce. Silk, when it was available, required special handling that most people simply couldn't manage at home. The concept of delicate fabrics, as we understand it today, didn't really exist for ordinary people. Clothes were made to last, and they were expected to survive the harsh treatment of 18th century laundry methods. Garments were often reinforced at stress points and designed with the knowledge that they would be scrubbed vigorously and wrung by hand. Stains presented particular challenges. Without modern stain removers, people had to rely on folk remedies and harsh treatments that were often more damaging than the stains themselves. Blood might be treated with cold water and salt, grease with fuller's earth or chalk, and ink with milk or lemon juice. These treatments were hit or miss, and many garments bore permanent stains that today would be easily removed. The social implications of laundry were significant. A woman's skill at managing the household washing was considered a crucial domestic accomplishment. A wife who could keep her family's clothes clean and in good repair was highly valued, while one who struggled with these tasks faced social criticism. The appearance of a family's clothing was a direct reflection of the woman's competence as a homemaker. Seasonal variations added another layer of complexity to the laundry routine. Spring cleaning wasn't just about dusting and sweeping. It was about washing all the heavy woolens that had been worn through the winter, along with blankets, coverlets, and other textiles that had accumulated months of grime. This massive undertaking could take weeks and often required the help of neighbors or hired assistants. The tools used in 18th century laundry were simple but effective within their limitations. Besides the washboard and iron kettles, households might own wooden tubs for soaking, paddles for stirring the wash, and various sizes of baskets for sorting and carrying. Wealthier families might own a mangle, a large wooden press used for smoothing and pressing flat items like sheets and tablecloths. Water quality was a constant concern. Well water might be hard, requiring more soap and making rinsing difficult. River water could be contaminated with industrial waste or sewage. Some families collected rainwater in barrels, considering it the purest option for washing, but this meant being dependent on weather patterns and having adequate storage. The economics of laundry in the 1700s were significant. The cost of soap, the fuel needed to heat water, and the wear and tear on clothing all represented major household expenses. Many families made their own soap to save money, a process that required saving kitchen grease and collecting wood ash throughout the year. The annual soap making was often a community activity, with neighbors pooling resources and labor. For families without access to adequate water or facilities, commercial laundries were beginning to appear in larger cities. These establishments, charged high fees, but could handle the heavy work that was beyond the capability of some households. However, the quality of work varied greatly, and there were frequent complaints about damaged or lost items. The laundry process also had significant health implications. The combination of hot water, caustic soap, and physical exertion led to numerous injuries and health problems. Burns from scalding water or hot irons were common. The repeated exposure to harsh chemicals caused skin problems and respiratory issues. The physical demands of the work contributed to premature aging and chronic pain conditions. Regional variations in laundry practices reflected local resources and climate conditions. In areas with abundant wood, families could afford to heat more water and wash more frequently. In regions where wood was scarce, washing was done less often and with cooler water. Coastal areas might use seawater for initial washing, taking advantage of its natural cleaning properties, while inland areas relied entirely on fresh water. The timing of laundry was carefully coordinated with other household activities. The same fire that heated wash water might also be used for cooking, and the timing had to be carefully managed to accommodate both needs. The large quantities of hot water produced during laundry day were often used for other purposes: bathing, scalding dishes, or cleaning floors. Professional laundresses, women who made their living by taking in washing, occupied a unique position. In 18th century society, they were skilled tradeswomen who understood the intricacies of different fabrics and stains, but they were also often looked down upon because their work was considered menial. These women developed specialized knowledge about cleaning techniques and often guarded their methods as trade secrets. The laundry routine also affected men's roles in the household. While washing was considered women's work, men often had to assist with the heavy lifting, water carrying, and other physically demanding aspects of the process. Boys might be responsible for keeping the fire burning and carrying wood, while girls learned the intricate skills of sorting, scrubbing, and ironing. The development of specialized laundry buildings or rooms reflected the importance of this activity. In daily life, wealthier households might have a separate washhouse equipped with built-in tubs, storage for supplies, and proper drainage. These facilities made the work somewhat easier, but were far beyond the reach of ordinary families. The preservation of clothing between washings was crucial, given the difficulty of the washing process. People developed elaborate methods for protecting their clothes from dirt and wear. Aprons, sleeve protectors, and detachable collars and cuffs were commonly used to keep the main garment clean longer. These protective items could be washed more frequently than the garments themselves. The social ritual of communal washing also played an important role in community life. In some areas, women would gather at streams or public washing facilities, turning the arduous task into a social occasion. These gatherings provided opportunities for exchanging news, sharing techniques, and maintaining social bonds. The isolation of individual household washing was offset by these community connections. Now let us turn our attention from the realm of clothing to the most intimate aspect of 18th century hygiene, the human body itself. If the laundry practices of the 1700s seem foreign to modern sensibilities, the bathing habits of our ancestors would seem positively shocking. Picture this. It's a crisp October evening in 1745, and Jonathan Whitmore, a successful London merchant, is preparing for what will be his only full bath of the year. This isn't neglect or laziness. This is perfectly normal behavior for a man of his social standing. The elaborate preparations beginning in his household would be familiar to anyone of means during this era, yet utterly bewildering to us today. The prevailing medical wisdom of the time held that frequent bathing was not only unnecessary, but actually dangerous to one's health. Physicians warned that hot water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to disease and corruption. Cold water was thought to shock the system and potentially cause death. The skin, they believed, served as a protective barrier, and washing, it too frequently would weaken this natural defense. These weren't the superstitions of ignorant people, they were the considered opinions of the most educated medical minds of the era. The Royal College of Physicians published treatises explaining how excessive bathing could lead to consumption, fever, and a host of other ailments. Given that medical knowledge was limited and the connection between germs and disease was unknown, these warnings carried tremendous weight. Jonathan's servants begin their preparations by heating massive quantities of water over the kitchen fire. This isn't a simple matter of turning a tap. Every drop must be carried from the well, heated in copper kettles, and transported upstairs to his chamber. The process takes hours and requires the efforts of multiple servants. The cost in fuel alone makes frequent bathing prohibitively expensive for all but the wealthiest families. The bathtub itself is a marvel of 18th century craftsmanship, a large wooden vessel lined with linen to prevent splinters. It's portable, stored in the attic between uses, and requires 4 strong men to carry it when filled. The wealthy might own such a tub, but most people may do with smaller wooden basins or, more commonly, simple bowls for washing specific parts of the body. As Jonathan settles into his annual bath, the water temperature is carefully monitored. Too hot, and it might prove fatal according to medical advice. Too cold, and it would fail to serve its purpose. The bathwater itself is often scented with herbs or oils, not for luxury, but because the smell of unwashed bodies can be overwhelming even to noses accustomed to 18th century odors. The bathing process is surprisingly brief by modern standards. Jonathan soaks for perhaps 15 minutes, using a coarse soap made from animal fat and lye. This soap is harsh enough to remove dirt, but also harsh enough to irritate the skin. There's no leisurely soaking or relaxation. This is a utilitarian process designed to remove the most obvious dirt and grime, but Jonathan represents the privileged class. For the vast majority of the population, farmers, laborers, servants, and urban poor, full-body bathing was virtually unknown. These people might go years without submerging their entire body in water. Their concept of cleanliness was radically different from ours, focused on washing visible parts of the body and maintaining clean clothing rather than overall bodily hygiene. The typical washing routine for an ordinary person involved what was called dry cleaning, rubbing the skin with coarse linen cloths to remove dead skin and surface dirt. This was usually done upon rising, using whatever water was available, often cold from a wash basin. The face, hands, and sometimes feet would be washed, but the rest of the body remained untouched by water for long periods. Women faced additional challenges in maintaining cleanliness. The elaborate clothing of the era made bathing extremely difficult. The multiple layers, tight lacings, and complex undergarments meant that undressing for a bath was a major undertaking requiring assistance. Many women's garments were designed to be worn for extended periods without removal, with detachable elements that could be washed separately. The monthly cycles that women experienced were managed without the benefit of modern hygiene products. Rags, often made from old linen, were washed and reused. The taboos surrounding menstruation meant that these matters were handled with extreme discretion, and the additional hygiene challenges were simply accepted as part of women's lives. Personal cleanliness varied dramatically by profession and social class. Blacksmiths, chimney sweeps, and other workers in dirty trades might be permanently stained with the materials of their work. Farmers lived in close proximity to animals and accepted a level of dirt that would be unthinkable today. Even merchants and professionals like Jonathan carried the accumulated grime of daily life in an era before effective personal hygiene. The hair presented particular challenges in the 18th century. Without modern shampoos, hair was rarely washed with water. Instead, people used powder, often made from flour or starch, to absorb oils and provide a clean appearance. This powder was combed through the hair and was supposed to carry away dirt and grease. The result was hair that appeared clean but was actually quite dirty beneath the powder. Wigs, which were fashionable among the upper classes, presented their own hygiene challenges. These expensive hairpieces were made from human hair, horsehair, or even goat hair, and they required specialized care. Wig powder, pomade, and other treatments were used to maintain their appearance, but the wigs themselves were rarely cleaned thoroughly. They became repositories for dust, powder, and various forms of debris. The practice of powdering hair and wigs had practical as well as aesthetic purposes. The powder helped control lice and other parasites that were common in an era of poor hygiene. However, the powder also attracted insects and could harbor bacteria, creating new health problems while solving others. Teeth cleaning in the 1700s was primitive at best. Toothbrushes, when they existed, were made from twigs or animal hair bristles, and were luxury items. Most people cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with coarse cloth or using their fingers. Tooth powder, made from ground bone, coral, or other abrasive materials, was used by those who could afford it, but it often did more harm than good, wearing away tooth enamel. The state of dental hygiene was reflected in the condition of people's teeth. Tooth loss was common and accepted as a normal part of aging. Even young adults often had missing or severely damaged teeth. The wealthy might afford dental care, but for most people, tooth problems were simply endured until the tooth fell out or the pain became unbearable. Bad breath was a universal problem in an era of poor dental hygiene and limited dietary variety. People used various remedies, chewing herbs, using mouth rinses made from wine or vinegar, or simply accepting it as unavoidable. The close quarters in which people lived meant that everyone was accustomed to the odors of others. The concept of deodorant or antiperspirant didn't exist. Body odor was controlled, if at all, through the use of perfumes, scented powders, or aromatic herbs. The wealthy might use expensive imported scents, while ordinary people relied on whatever fragrant plants they could gather. However, these measures were more about masking odors than preventing them. Undergarments played a crucial role in 18th century hygiene. Linen shirts and shifts, worn next to the skin, were supposed to absorb body oils and dirt. These garments were changed more frequently than outer clothing and were considered the primary means of maintaining bodily cleanliness. A person with several clean linen shirts could maintain an appearance of cleanliness even without bathing. The quality and quantity of undergarments varied greatly by social class. A wealthy person might own a dozen linen shirts, allowing for frequent changes, while a poor person might own only the shirt on their back. The condition of one's linen was considered a key indicator of social status and personal hygiene. Seasonal bathing patterns were influenced by both weather and cultural practices. Spring was often associated with a general cleaning, when people might bathe to wash away the accumulated grime of winter. However, winter bathing was avoided, not just for comfort, but because it was considered medically dangerous. The cold air and lack of adequate heating made the risk of illness very real. Public bathhouses, which had been common in medieval times, had largely disappeared by the 1700s. This was partly due to changing moral attitudes. Bathhouses were associated with prostitution and other immoral activities. But it was also due to medical advice warning against the dangers of public bathing facilities, which were believed to spread disease. The wealthy sometimes maintained private bathhouses or dedicated bathing rooms, but these were rare and used infrequently. These facilities were more about status and luxury than regular hygiene. The elaborate preparations required for a bath made it an event rather than a routine activity. Water quality was a constant concern for those who did choose to bathe. Well water might contain harmful minerals or bacteria. River water could be contaminated with sewage or industrial waste. Some people preferred rainwater for bathing, believing it to be purer, but collection and storage presented their own challenges. The temperature of bath water was carefully controlled based on medical advice of the era. Physicians recommended tepid water as the safest option, hot enough to be effective, but not so hot as to be dangerous. This narrow temperature range, combined with the difficulty of heating large quantities of water, made bathing a precisely managed activity. Soap quality varied dramatically in the 18th century. The wealthy could afford fine soaps made with olive oil and scented with expensive ingredients imported from far-off lands. These soaps were gentle on the skin and pleasant to use. But for most people, soap was a harsh, caustic substance that could cause burns and irritation. Many people avoided using soap altogether, preferring to bathe in plain water when they bathed at all. The medicinal properties attributed to bathing varied by culture and region. Some believed that certain herbs added to bath water could cure diseases or improve health. Others thought that bathing in specific types of water, seawater, mineral springs, or water blessed by religious authorities, had therapeutic benefits. These beliefs influenced bathing practices and made the activity as much about medicine as cleanliness. Regional differences in bathing practices reflected local customs, climate, and available resources. People living near hot springs might bathe more frequently, taking advantage of naturally heated water. Those in cold climates might avoid bathing entirely during winter months. Cultural attitudes toward nudity and privacy also influenced how and when people bathed. The privacy of bathing was a significant concern, especially for women. The process of undressing, bathing, and dressing again required considerable time and privacy, which was difficult to achieve in crowded households. This practical consideration often outweighed desires for cleanliness, particularly among the working classes who lived in small spaces with little privacy. Religious attitudes toward bathing were complex and varied. Some Christian denominations associated frequent bathing with vanity and worldly concerns, preferring spiritual cleanliness to physical cleanliness. Others saw bathing as a form of purification with spiritual benefits. These religious influences shaped individual attitudes toward personal hygiene throughout the century. The economic costs of bathing extended beyond just the water and fuel. Soap was expensive, towels and bathing cloths required washing and maintenance, and the time required for bathing could interfere with productive work. For families living on the edge of subsistence, these costs made regular bathing an unaffordable luxury. Children's bathing practices were similarly limited. Infants might be bathed more frequently than adults, but even this was controversial. Some believed that bathing babies made them more susceptible to illness, while others thought it was necessary for health. As children grew older, they typically adopted the bathing patterns of their families, which usually meant infrequent full baths. The transition from childhood to adulthood brought new considerations about bathing and hygiene. Young adults, particularly those of marriageable age, might pay more attention to cleanliness as part of their attractiveness to potential partners. However, this was usually limited to washing visible parts of the body and maintaining clean clothing rather than full-body bathing. Marriage and family life brought additional complications to bathing practices. Sharing bathing facilities and water between family members was common for economic reasons, but it also raised questions about modesty and propriety. The order in which family members bathed was often determined by social hierarchies within the household. The preparation for special occasions might include more elaborate bathing routines, Weddings, religious ceremonies, or important social events could prompt individuals to undertake the elaborate process of a full bath. However, these occasions were rare, and most people went through daily life without ever experiencing what we would consider basic cleanliness. Professional bathers, individuals who specialized in assisting others with bathing, existed in some urban areas. These were usually women who served wealthy households, helping with the elaborate preparations required for bathing and providing specialized knowledge about soaps, herbs, and bathing techniques. Their services were expensive and available only to the elite. The tools and equipment used for bathing were simple but carefully maintained. Bathing tubs, when they existed, were valuable household items that required careful storage and maintenance. Bathing cloths, soaps, and other supplies were precious commodities that were used sparingly and carefully preserved between uses. Personal grooming beyond bathing was equally limited by the standards of the time. Nail care consisted of keeping nails short and reasonably clean, but elaborate manicures were unknown. Hair care focused on removing obvious dirt and maintaining fashionable styles rather than cleanliness. Skin care was limited to protecting against obvious damage from sun and wind. The social signaling aspects of cleanliness were important in 18th century society. A person's apparent cleanliness, as judged by their clothing, visible skin, and general appearance, communicated their social status and personal discipline. However, this visible cleanliness often masked the reality of bodies that had not been thoroughly washed in months or years. Disease prevention through hygiene was poorly understood in the 1700s. The connection between cleanliness and health was not scientifically established, and medical advice often ran counter to what we now know to be healthy practices. This meant that people made decisions about bathing based on incomplete or incorrect information, often to the detriment of their health. The psychological aspects of cleanliness were also different in the 18th century. People who lived with constant body odor, dirty clothing, and unwashed skin developed different tolerances and expectations. What would seem unbearably dirty to modern sensibilities was simply normal life for people of this era. The preservation of modesty during bathing was a constant concern, particularly for women. The elaborate clothing of the era provided significant coverage and protection of modesty in daily life, but bathing required a level of undress that was uncomfortable. For many people, this tension between cleanliness and modesty often resolved in favor of modesty. Seasonal variations in bathing practices were pronounced. Summer heat might encourage more frequent washing of exposed skin, while winter cold made any bathing a potentially dangerous activity. The availability of water, fuel for heating, and suitable indoor spaces all varied with the seasons, affecting when and how people could bathe. The communal aspects of bathing, when it occurred, reflected social hierarchies and family structures. In households where bathing did take place, the order of bathers was carefully determined by age, gender, and social position. The head of household typically bathed first in the cleanest water, with others following in prescribed order. Moving from the intimate realm of personal bathing to the broader landscape of human hygiene, we encounter practices and beliefs that would challenge every assumption we hold about cleanliness, health, and social norms. The 18th century presented a world where the very foundations of what we consider hygienic were not merely different, they were often completely inverted. Consider the morning routine of Elizabeth Cavendish, the wife of a prosperous wool merchant. In Norwich, England, as she rises on a typical day in 1760, what we might expect to be a ritual of washing and grooming is instead a careful process of concealment and preservation. Elizabeth begins her day not by washing her face with water, but by dusting it with a fine powder made from ground wheat and white lead. This powder serves multiple purposes. It whitens her complexion to the fashionable pale standard of beauty, covers blemishes and imperfections, and masks the natural oils that have accumulated on her skin overnight. The white lead in her face powder is slowly poisoning her, causing headaches, digestive problems, and gradual neurological damage that she attributes to other causes. But Elizabeth, like thousands of other women of her era, has no knowledge of these toxic effects. The powder is expensive, imported, and recommended by the finest cosmetic authorities of the day. It represents the pinnacle of sophisticated hygiene and beauty care. Her hands, which she washes more frequently than any other part of her body due to their visibility in social situations, are treated with a mixture of lemon juice and ground almonds. This concoction is supposed to whiten and soften the skin, but the acidic lemon juice often causes irritation and cracking. She covers this damage with gloves whenever possible, as rough or discolored hands would mark her as a woman who does. Manual labor. Elizabeth's teeth, like those of most people in her social class, are beginning to show the effects of a diet high in sugar and refined foods, combined with virtually no dental care. She rinses her mouth with wine mixed with herbs, a practice recommended by physicians for maintaining oral health. The alcohol provides some antiseptic benefit, but the sugar content of the wine feeds the bacteria that are destroying her teeth. Her breath, despite the wine rinse, carries the accumulated odors of poor dental hygiene, digestive problems common to the era's diet, and the general internal uncleanliness that results from infrequent bathing. She attempts to mask this with small sachets of dried herbs and spices that she carries in her clothing, occasionally breathing through them when in close conversation with others. The elaborate process of dressing requires the assistance of her maid, not just because of the complexity of 18th century clothing, but because Elizabeth herself cannot reach many parts of her body to clean them. The layers of undergarments, stays, and outer clothing create a micro-environment around her body that traps heat, moisture, and odors. These clothes will not be changed for days or weeks, depending on their visibility and her social schedule. Her undergarments, the primary defense against body odor and dirt, are made of linen that has been yellowed by repeated washing with harsh soap and has absorbed months of accumulated body oils. The linen is supposed to be changed regularly, but regularly in 1760 means perhaps once a week for the wealthy and much less frequently for ordinary people. The pins, tapes, and other fasteners used to secure her clothing are often shared between garments and rarely cleaned. These small items become repositories for dirt, skin cells, and bacteria, contributing to skin irritation and infection. The metal pins and hooks can rust from accumulated moisture, leaving stains on clothing and potentially causing tetanus infections in minor scratches. Elizabeth's hair, elaborately styled and powdered, has not been washed with water in over 2 months. The powder, made from flower and orris root, was applied over the existing layer of oils, dirt, and previous powder applications. Her scalp itches constantly from the accumulated debris, and she uses a long-handled scratching stick to relieve the irritation without disturbing her hairstyle. The pomades and oils used to maintain her hairstyle have attracted dust, insects, and various forms of debris. Small insects living in her hair are common and accepted as unavoidable. She occasionally finds evidence of mice or rats that have been attracted to the flour-based powder, particularly at night when her hair is uncovered. Her fingernails, grown long to demonstrate that she doesn't perform manual labor, harbor significant amounts of dirt and bacteria. Nail care consists primarily of shaping and occasional cleaning with a small knife or pin. The undersides of her nails are black with accumulated grime that would take aggressive scrubbing to remove, scrubbing that would be considered inappropriate. For a lady of her station, the cosmetics and treatments Elizabeth uses are not merely ineffective by modern standards, Many are actively harmful. The white lead in her face powder is slowly causing organ damage. The mercury in some of her other cosmetics is affecting her nervous system. The various plant-based preparations she uses are untested and unregulated, sometimes containing toxic compounds that cause rashes, burns, or worse. Her bedroom, where she spends approximately 8 hours each day, has not been cleaned in any modern sense. The floors are swept occasionally to remove visible debris, but there is no concept of disinfection or deep cleaning. The bed linens are changed monthly at best, and the mattress itself is a repository for dead skin cells, body oils, and various forms of organic matter that support populations of insects and other organisms. The chamber pot that serves her nighttime needs is emptied daily by servants, but it's cleaned only perfunctorily. The wooden or ceramic vessel retains odors and stains that make her bedroom a constantly malodorous environment. The waste from the chamber pot is typically thrown into the street or into rivers, contributing to the general unsanitary conditions of urban life. Personal privacy, which we consider essential for intimate hygiene activities, is largely unknown to Elizabeth despite her wealth. Servants come and go constantly, family members share spaces, and the concept of a private bathroom is unknown. Personal hygiene activities are conducted in the presence of others or in spaces that offer minimal privacy. The water Elizabeth uses for the limited washing she does is stored in ewers and basins that are cleaned infrequently. The water itself may have been standing for days, developing growths of bacteria and algae. There is no understanding of water quality or purification, so she may be introducing more contamination than she removes through her washing activities. Her clothing serves as both protection and prison. The multiple layers trap body heat and moisture, creating ideal conditions for bacterial growth. The tight lacing of stays and other garments restricts movement and prevents air circulation. The heavy fabrics and elaborate construction make the clothing impossible to clean effectively, so dirt and odors accumulate continuously. The social spaces Elizabeth inhabits are equally challenging from a hygiene perspective. Churches, theaters, social gatherings, and public spaces are filled with people who share her limited hygiene practices. The accumulated effect of dozens or hundreds of people with similar cleanliness standards creates environments that would be considered unbearable by modern standards. During social visits, Elizabeth and her companions use fans not only for cooling and fashion, but also to create air movement that might disperse some of the accumulated body odors. The fans themselves, made of feathers, fabric, or paper, are rarely cleaned and become repositories for the odors they're meant to combat. The food Elizabeth eats is prepared and served under conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Kitchen hygiene is minimal, food storage is primitive, and the connection between cleanliness and health is not understood. She regularly consumes food that is contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and other harmful organisms, contributing to the digestive problems that affect most people of her era. Her social circle consists of people with similar hygiene practices, creating a shared standard of cleanliness that, while shocking to modern sensibilities, is considered normal and appropriate for their time and class. The sensory experience of social interaction, the sounds, smells, and tactile sensations are dominated by the effects of poor hygiene, but these are simply accepted as part of human existence. The medical advice Elizabeth receives from physicians reinforces rather than corrects her hygiene practices. Doctors warn against excessive washing, recommend potentially harmful cosmetics and treatments, and attribute diseases to causes that have nothing to do with cleanliness. The most educated medical minds of the era actively discourage practices that we now know are essential for health. Elizabeth's experience with menstruation exemplifies the hygiene challenges faced by women of the era. Without modern sanitary products, She relies on rags and cloth that must be washed and reused. The washing of these items is done in secrecy, often with cold water and minimal soap. The rags themselves become repositories for bacteria and odors, and the inadequate cleaning contributes to infections and other health problems. The seasonal variations in Elizabeth's hygiene practices reflect both practical constraints and cultural beliefs. Winter brings additional layers of clothing that are worn for months without removal, creating even more challenging conditions for personal cleanliness. Summer heat makes the effects of poor hygiene more pronounced, but also makes the physical effort of washing more difficult to endure. Religious beliefs influence Elizabeth's approach to personal hygiene in complex ways. Some religious teachings emphasize the importance of spiritual cleanliness over physical cleanliness, suggesting that excessive attention to bodily appearance represents vanity and worldly concerns that distract from proper devotion. Other religious perspectives view certain types of washing as purification rituals with spiritual significance, but these are typically limited to specific ceremonies rather than daily practice. The pregnancy and childbirth experiences of women like Elizabeth reveal additional dimensions of 18th century hygiene challenges. Pregnant women are advised against bathing, as the hot water and physical exertion are believed to be dangerous to both mother and child. This means that during the 9 months of pregnancy and the recovery period following birth, women experience even less personal cleanliness than usual. The birthing process itself takes place in rooms that are sealed against dangerous fresh air, creating stuffy, contaminated environments where infections flourish. Childbirth attendants, typically midwives or female relatives, bring their own hygiene challenges to the birthing chamber. Their hands, which have not been washed in any meaningful sense, carry bacteria and other contaminants directly into contact with the most vulnerable moments of human life. The cloths, instruments, and other materials used during birth are reused between different women, with minimal cleaning, spreading infections, and contributing to the high mortality rates of both mothers and infants. The care of infants and children reflects the hygiene limitations of the era in particularly tragic ways. Babies are swaddled in cloths that are changed infrequently, creating constant contact with waste and moisture. The practice of tight swaddling, while intended to protect the child, actually creates conditions that promote skin irritation, infection, and other health problems. Diaper rash, skin infections, and other conditions that we now easily prevent or treat were common and serious health threats for infants. Children's clothing is designed to be practical rather than clean, with dark colors and heavy fabrics that hide dirt and stains. Children are expected to play and work in dirty conditions, and their clothing reflects this reality. The idea that children require special cleanliness considerations is largely unknown, and children's hygiene practices are simply scaled-down versions of adult practices. The transition from childhood to adulthood brings new hygiene challenges. As young people begin to experience the physical changes of puberty, the increased oil production, body odor, and other changes that accompany adolescence are managed with the same limited tools and knowledge available to adults. Young women beginning menstruation face particular challenges as they must learn to manage this new hygiene requirement with minimal guidance and inadequate materials. Educational institutions, where they exist, reflect the general hygiene standards of the era. Schools are poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and rarely cleaned. Students and teachers alike bring their personal hygiene limitations into shared spaces, creating environments where diseases spread rapidly. The concept of hygiene education is unknown, and children learn about cleanliness primarily through observation and imitation of adult behaviors. The workplace environments of the 18th century present additional hygiene challenges that vary dramatically by occupation. Merchants like Elizabeth's husband work in spaces filled with dust, animal products, and other materials that contribute to poor air quality and surface contamination. Craftsmen and artisans work with materials that permanently stain their hands and clothing, making certain types of cleanliness impossible to achieve. Agricultural workers, who represent the majority of the population, live and work in close contact with animals and animal waste. The barnyard, with its mixture of mud, manure, and decaying organic matter, is a daily environment for millions of people. The hygiene practices of rural communities are adapted to these realities, with different standards and expectations than those of urban dwellers. Domestic servants, who are responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of wealthy households, face unique challenges in managing their own hygiene while performing dirty work. They are expected to appear clean and presentable when serving their employers, but their work involves constant contact with dirt, waste, and contaminated materials. The contradiction between their appearance requirements and work realities creates additional stress and difficulty in their daily lives. The seasonal rhythms of 18th century life profoundly affect hygiene practices in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. Spring cleaning represents not just a tidying up, but a massive undertaking to address the accumulated dirt and deterioration of the winter months. This might be the only time of year when certain items of clothing, bedding, and household textiles are thoroughly cleaned. Summer brings its own hygiene challenges, as the combination of heat, limited clothing changes, and poor ventilation makes body odor and other cleanliness issues more pronounced. The increased activity of insects, attracted to food, waste, and unwashed bodies, adds another layer of discomfort and potential health risk. Flies, in particular, are constant companions during warm weather, attracted to the many sources of organic matter associated with poor hygiene. Autumn represents a time of preparation for the hygiene challenges of winter, as families gather and preserve materials that will be needed during the cold months. This includes making soap, collecting and drying herbs for medicinal and cleaning purposes, and ensuring adequate supplies of cloth and other materials needed for basic hygiene maintenance. Winter presents the most severe hygiene challenges of the year. The cold makes washing with water extremely uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Heating water requires precious fuel that must be carefully rationed. The sealed, poorly ventilated spaces where people spend most of their time become concentrated environments of accumulated odors, moisture, and contamination. The economic implications of hygiene in the 18th century extend far beyond the immediate. Costs of soap and water. Poor hygiene contributes to illness, which reduces productivity and earning capacity. The time and labor required for what hygiene practices do exist represent significant opportunity costs for families already struggling with subsistence. The social consequences of failing to meet even the limited cleanliness standards of the era can affect employment, marriage prospects, and social standing. The development of trade and commerce during this period begins to introduce new hygiene products and possibilities, but these remain available only to the wealthy. Imported soaps, perfumes, and cosmetics represent luxury items that demonstrate wealth and social status. The growing middle class begins to aspire to these products, creating new markets and gradually expanding access to better hygiene materials. Urban environments present unique hygiene challenges that differ significantly from rural conditions. The concentration of people in small spaces creates sanitation problems that rural communities don't face. The lack of adequate waste disposal systems means that human and animal waste accumulates in streets and waterways. The air quality in urban areas is compromised by smoke from fires, industrial activities, and the general concentration of human activity. The relationship between social class and hygiene becomes more pronounced in urban settings, where different, Classes live in closer proximity, but with dramatically different access to hygiene resources. The wealthy urban dweller has access to imported soaps, clean water, and domestic help, while the urban poor live in conditions that make even basic cleanliness nearly impossible to achieve. Professional occupations begin to develop different hygiene standards based on their requirements for social interaction and public appearance. Lawyers, physicians, and merchants are expected to maintain higher standards of visible cleanliness than craftsmen or laborers. These expectations create pressure for professional advancement and social mobility, as improved hygiene becomes both a marker of and requirement for higher social status. The legal and regulatory environment of the 18th century includes virtually no provisions for public hygiene or sanitation. There are no health codes, sanitation requirements, or public hygiene standards. The responsibility for cleanliness rests entirely with individuals and families, with no collective or governmental support for maintaining public health through hygiene measures. Religious institutions play complex roles in hygiene practices, sometimes promoting cleanliness as a spiritual virtue, while also teaching that excessive concern with bodily appearance represents sinful vanity. Different religious denominations have varying approaches to these questions, creating different hygiene cultures within different communities. The scientific understanding of hygiene during this period is limited by the lack of knowledge about germs, bacteria, and the mechanisms of disease transmission. The most educated physicians and natural philosophers of the era work with theories of disease and health that often contradict effective hygiene practices. This means that even those with access to the best medical advice of the time may be following practices that are harmful to their health. The preservation of food and the prevention of spoilage represent significant challenges that affect both nutrition and hygiene. Without refrigeration or effective preservation methods, food spoilage is constant, and the consumption of partially spoiled food is common. The digestive problems and foodborne illnesses that result from poor food hygiene contribute to the general poor health of the population. The care of the sick and elderly reveals additional dimensions of 18th century hygiene challenges. Illness often means being confined to bed for extended periods without the ability to maintain even basic personal cleanliness. The care of bedridden individuals requires dealing with bodily waste, unchanged clothing, and accumulated dirt under conditions that make effective cleaning nearly impossible. The death and burial practices of the era reflect the limited understanding of hygiene and disease transmission. Bodies of the deceased are kept in homes for extended periods before burial, often in warm weather that accelerates decomposition. The preparation of bodies for burial is done without protective equipment or understanding of the health risks involved. Family and household structures affect hygiene practices in ways that modern people might not anticipate. Large families living in small spaces make privacy for personal hygiene activities nearly impossible. The sharing of beds, clothing, and other personal items spreads dirt, odors, and diseases throughout the household. The hierarchical nature of family relationships determines who has access to limited hygiene resources and in what order. The courtship and marriage customs of the era require young people to present themselves as attractively as possible despite the hygiene limitations of the time. This creates pressure to use cosmetics, perfumes, and other products that might mask the effects of poor hygiene. The intimate nature of marriage relationships means that couples must adapt to each other's hygiene standards and limitations. Treatment of mental illness during this period often involves hygiene deprivation as both a symptom and a supposed treatment. People with mental health conditions are often kept in conditions of extreme filth, based on beliefs that cleanliness is inappropriate for their condition, or that dirty conditions might somehow cure their ailments. Travel and transportation in the 18th century present additional hygiene challenges. Long journeys by horse, carriage, or ship involve extended periods without access to washing facilities or clean clothing. Travelers must carry their own hygiene supplies and adapt to whatever facilities are available at inns and stopping points. Along their routes, the military and naval services of the era create unique hygiene challenges for soldiers and sailors. Military campaigns involve long periods in the field without access to clean water, soap, or laundry facilities. Naval voyages can last months or years, with hundreds of men confined in small spaces with minimal hygiene resources. The health consequences of these conditions contribute significantly to military casualties and mortality rates. The development of early industrial processes begins to create new types of hygiene challenges as people work with new materials and in new environments. Textile manufacturing involves exposure to fibers and chemicals that create respiratory and skin problems. Metalworking involves exposure to toxic materials that accumulate in the body over time. The concept of occupational hygiene is unknown, and workers simply accept these health risks as part of their employment. The intersection of hygiene with fashion and social display creates interesting tensions in 18th century society. The elaborate clothing and hairstyles that demonstrate wealth and status are often incompatible with effective hygiene practices. The more elaborate and expensive the clothing, the more difficult it becomes to keep clean, creating a paradox where the highest expressions of social status involve the greatest hygiene challenges. The preservation and maintenance of textiles becomes a crucial skill in managing household hygiene. Women develop elaborate knowledge about treating stains, protecting fabrics from damage, and extending the life of expensive clothing through careful maintenance. This knowledge represents a significant body of practical expertise that is passed down through generations of women. The seasonal availability of plants and materials used for hygiene purposes affects the rhythm of household management. Certain herbs and plants used for cleaning and medicinal purposes are only available at specific times of year, requiring careful planning and preservation to ensure year-round supplies. The international trade in hygiene-related products begins to develop during this period, bringing new materials and possibilities to those who can afford them. Exotic soaps, perfumes, and cosmetics from distant lands represent the cutting edge of hygiene technology, but they remain luxury items available only to the wealthy. The apprenticeship and training systems of the era include hygiene requirements that vary by trade. Some professions require maintaining a certain standard of cleanliness for practical reasons, while others accept or even require getting dirty as part of the work. Young people learning trades must adapt to the hygiene standards and expectations of their chosen professions. As we draw our exploration of 18th century hygiene to a close, we must confront the stark reality that the daily existence of our ancestors was dominated by conditions that we would find not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely dangerous to health and well-being. The accumulated weight of poor hygiene practices, the infrequent bathing, the harsh and ineffective cleaning methods, the contaminated living environments, created a cascade of health problems that affected every aspect of human life. The infant mortality rates of the era, often exceeding 50% in urban areas, reflect the devastating impact of hygiene-related diseases. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, and countless other illnesses flourished in environments where the connection between cleanliness and health was not understood. The average life expectancy, decades shorter than what we experience today, was directly related to the hygiene practices we have examined. Yet within these limitations, people found ways to maintain dignity, express beauty, and create meaning in their lives. The elaborate rituals around clothing, The careful attention to visible cleanliness and the social protocols that managed the challenges of poor hygiene all represent human adaptability and resilience in the face of difficult circumstances. The transformation from the hygiene practices of the 1700s to our modern understanding of cleanliness represents one of the most dramatic changes in human living conditions in recorded history. The development of germ theory, the invention of modern soap and cleaning products, the creation of water and sewage systems, and the establishment of public health measures have eliminated hygiene challenges that once dominated daily life. But perhaps most importantly, our journey through the hygiene practices of the 18th century reminds us that what we consider normal, natural, and necessary are actually the products of specific historical circumstances, scientific discoveries, and technological developments. The daily shower, the fresh clothing, the clean water that we take for granted represent achievements that would have seemed miraculous to people like Elizabeth Cavendish and Jonathan Whitmore. The women who spent 3 days each week struggling with laundry, the families who shared bathwater and considered annual bathing luxurious, the children who grew up accepting body odor and dirty clothing as normal parts of life. These people were not ignorant or careless. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge, resources, and technologies available to them. Their struggles with hygiene were not separate from their struggles with poverty, disease, social inequality, and the harsh realities of pre-industrial life. The difficulty of heating water was connected to the scarcity of fuel. The infrequency of bathing was related to medical beliefs about health and safety. The acceptance of dirt and odor was tied to the social structures and economic realities that governed their lives. As we flip a switch to turn on hot water, squeeze soap from a plastic bottle, or toss dirty clothes into a washing machine, we participate in a daily miracle that would have been incomprehensible to people living just a few centuries ago. The infrastructure, knowledge, and resources that make modern hygiene possible represent the accumulated achievements of countless generations of human innovation and effort. The story of hygiene in the 1700s is ultimately a story about human adaptation, resilience, and the gradual improvement of living conditions through knowledge, technology, and social organization. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that improvements in human welfare require constant effort and attention, and that the comforts we enjoy today are the products of specific historical developments that could have taken different paths. Understanding how our ancestors lived, struggled, and adapted to hygiene challenges that we can barely imagine helps us appreciate not only how far we have come, but also how much effort and innovation were required to create the world we now inhabit. The daily routines of washing, cleaning, and maintaining hygiene that we perform almost automatically represent the culmination of centuries of human learning and technological development. The transformation of human hygiene practices stands as one of the great achievements of modern civilization, fundamentally altering the human experience and making possible the health, longevity, and quality of life that we now consider normal. Yet this transformation was built on the struggles, adaptations, and gradual improvements made by people who faced hygiene challenges that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. In understanding their world, we better understand our own and perhaps gain a deeper appreciation for the daily miracles of cleanliness that surround us in the modern world.